This DVD project is a collaboration between three entities. Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries is a group of theological educators. Just Money Advisors are financial professionals. And the third partner were two Southern California presbyteries. This six-part series is based on a workshop model that was funded in part by the Presbyterian Hunger Action Network. Most of this material was filmed at Baldwin Park Presbyterian Church in January of 2009. The design of this program is to start broadly with an overview of the biblical ethos of sharing and justice, and a broad brush portrait of some of the most pressing social and economic issues facing our churches today. Through the course of these 6 sessions, however, we will funnel down our focus to examine how we might respond to the biblical vision of Sabbath economics. The final focus of this program, therefore, is the very specific practice of ethical and community investment of surplus capital as a concrete expression of Christian discipleship. This series of 6 30 to 40-minute segments is meant for group reflection, such as adult education, midweek Bible study, or a small reading group. And we encourage you to use the accompanying study guide as you work through this material. We want to thank you in advance for your concern, interest, and commitment in working through this material. We hope that it will help you deepen your own practices of Sabbath economics. The standard of economic and social justice is woven into the warp and weft of the entire biblical tradition. The heart of this witness calls us to observe what, throughout this presentation, we're going to call Sabbath economics. At its root, Sabbath economics is about gift and about grace. It's about the grace of receiving that which the Creator gives freely to all, and the responsibility not to take too much or to mistake the gift as a possession. The economic implications of this tradition as it's articulated throughout Scripture can be summarized in 3 axioms. These 3 axioms are as follows. The world as created by God is abundant with enough for everyone, provided that human communities restrain their appetites and live within appropriate limits. The second axiom is that disparities in wealth and power are not, in fact, part of the natural order. They are the result of human sinfulness, and therefore this sin must be mitigated in communities of faith through strategies of just sharing and distribution of goods. The third biblical axiom is that the prophets call us to such strategies of redistribution. And throughout the Bible, this is characterized as a proclamation of good news, even though sometimes it feels like hard news, particularly if we have too much of the gift. The theology of Sabbath economics and its ethic of regular and systemic wealth and power redistribution, clearly summed up, as we'll see, in the Jubilee ethos of debt forgiveness and the return of lands to the homeless and the release of slaves. This is neither utopian nor abstract. It is a very concrete ethos, way of life, which arose from the historic experience of Hebrew slavery in Egypt. And so it seeks to be both corrective, but also preventative. I believe that this ethos continues to offer communities of faith today a way out of some of the worst dysfunctional behavior in our contemporary economy. And that's what this project is all about. talking about economics in church is largely considered taboo. It's even more taboo to talk about than sex. And that is because there's such a great deal of mystification around the economy and around the ethics of economics in our churches. Our churches, by and large, have not done a good job at equipping us as believers to respond faithfully, not only to crisis in the economy, but also to the day-to-day life in our own households, how we handle our own money. Economics, of course, is a topic that is intensely personal on one hand and profoundly political on the other. So we feel that it helps to take a step back and to try to look at the fundamental issues of economics and justice as a way of trying to grab a hold of a faith-based perspective on what's happening out there, and more importantly, what's happening in our own economic lives. Here's the first fundamental fact, and that is that we live in a world of great economic inequality. And as Hoey has put it, in the church we tend to read the gospel as if we didn't have money, and we tend to spend our money as if there were no gospel. But the consequence of economic inequality, of fundamental structural economic inequality, is individual and social self-destruction. And we all feel that. We feel that through the consequences of crime. We feel that through the consequences of unemployment. We feel that through the consequences of civil unrest. And that specifically affects the most vulnerable classes, such as women and children and the elderly. Now, we, in our pedagogy, don't believe in the power of facts and figures to move hearts and minds, so we are not going to throw a bunch of fact sheets at you, but we just think it's very important in having this conversation that we start with the basic understanding that we have not solved the problems of global poverty. Nor have we solved, this is hypothesis number 2, the problems of domestic wealth disparity. So poverty is not just something that happens in Darfur or in East Timor or in Mozambique. Poverty is something that happens right here at home. Now that wealth disparity can be described in lots of different ways, and again, there are lots of fact sheets that are available. We particularly recommend the work of United for a Fair Economy. But if you look at this chart, you'll see that the distribution of wealth, which in the bottom lower right-hand corner, that's the classic pie and how it's divided in the United States, and you see really that the top 10% of income earners in this country control more than half the wealth. That's the kind of structural inequality that we're talking about. But you see this is also a dynamic situation. In the top left-hand corner, you see that over the last 20 years or so, there's actually been a intensification of the disparity between rich and poor. So you see a net gain of about 40% among the richest 1% and a net loss of almost 3/4 of the net worth in the bottom 40% of the economy. That translates into things like homelessness, mental health issues, suicide, and other kinds of things that we're constantly dealing with at a practical level in our churches. So wealth disparity here at home has a history, and that history is one now that is becoming clear to us. When there is so much wealth disparity, sooner or later, the house of cards economy that caters to the richest and ignores the poorest is going to fall apart. And that's what we're seeing now. So again, we draw your attention to United for a Fair Economy, which is out of New England, out of Boston, one of the best sources both on the web and in terms of books and fact sheets if you're interested in exploring the dimensions of economic inequality here domestically. But there's a third hypothesis as well, which we think is rather indisputable, and that is we have not solved the question of affluence, or what the PBS series a few years ago called the disease of affluenza. Just as there is a pathology involved in having not enough to take care of one's basic needs, so too there's a disease of having too much. And we haven't solved that problem in our country either. If we think about the triple disease of affluenza, we could talk about the problem of alienation, the problem of anxiety, and the problem of addiction, all of which are factors which characterize our individual and collective lives in a society that has too much. We live in a world that has a fundamental social architecture that keeps people divided according to wealth and poverty. And it's a social architecture of segregation that keeps people separate and unequal that's every bit as effective as Jim Crow laws were 100 years ago. Now, on top of all of that, we have entered into a new era, an era which many call the New Depression. I've been reading a historian of the Depression by the name of Robert McElwain, and he says, quoting Mark Twain, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And he says what we're experiencing today is not exactly the same as the Great Depression that began in 1929, but there's a lot of rhyming going on. And he argues that the reason we're experiencing this again is we haven't learned the lessons of the Great Depression last time around, particularly our over-reliance on credit and the circulation of easy money. So that's our historic moment. That's our social situation. It is a scenario that we have to talk about in our churches. Would you agree? To remain silent on these issues is to abandon our people pastorally and to leave them prophetically mute. So it's our hope that this seminar will begin to help us and encourage us along the way of breaking our silence. I think the words of a contemporary social thinker by the name of William Grider are really interesting. He's no radical, but what he says is that the operating principles of capitalism have become dangerously obsolete. The house of economics is due for major renovation, if not a complete teardown. And then he says something very interesting which ought to catch our theological attention. He says, we need a new narrative. We need a new economic story. We've been living in a story that is not serving us well. That being said then, what we want to do for a few minutes is, as people of faith, turn to a different tradition of story. For us, of course, our central resource in trying to build some political imagination is to start with Scripture. The Bible, however, represents a very different economic story, one that grates and even contradicts the fundamentals of the economic story we are in. And that's one of the reasons, I suspect, that we don't hear a lot about it from our pulpits or in our adult Sunday school classes, is that we feel uncomfortable with the contradictions between the biblical narrative of economics and the big story of poverty and affluence that we live in. To some extent, that means that the Bible's teaching about economics has been marginalized or silenced also. What we would like to do now is to unsilence that. Now, you came to this seminar with the title of Sabbath Economics, and we want to try to explain that phrase because we know it's a little bit of a different phrase. You might not be familiar with it. So here's what we mean by Sabbath economics. The word from which our term economics comes from is the Greek term oikonomia. Now, oikonomia means simply the management of the household. It is how folk deal day to day with their labor, their production, their consumption. So economics means nothing less than how we handle our money, our work. That's probably more familiar, but what does that have to do with Sabbath? Sabbath means, in the biblical tradition, the recentering of human life on being rather than doing. Now that's hugely important in a culture like ours, where most of us get our identity from what we do, from the job we have, from the money we spend, from the stuff we buy, from the way that we change the world. We are compulsive doers in American society. And when we stop, we become confused about who we are. That's one of the reasons why typically men of my father's generation, when they retired, they died because they didn't know who they were, which is what happened to my father. Not an uncommon story. So we are people who aren't too clear who we are apart from our doing. So we are workaholics. We are people who follow the money and move where the jobs are because we don't really have a sense of community that's not centered around our work life. But Sabbath suggests that who we really are is who we are when we stop doing, who we are before God, aside from our production, aside from our consumption. And that leads to the second principle of Sabbath in the Bible, and that is that the Sabbath tradition attempts to set very concrete limits on human activity. Now, we in Christian culture have a fairly pejorative attitude toward that. We think of the Sabbath laws as sort of curious and rather niggling prohibitions of little things that one shouldn't do. And that's the reason why that tradition has almost entirely atrophied now in the modern Christian church. In fact, we live in an economic culture where we can now produce 24/7. That's what laptops and cell phones are all about. We can work all the time, at home, at the office, in the car. We're working constantly. And we can consume 24/7. That's the beauty of online shopping. At 2 a.m., you can go online and purchase something. There are no limits of time and space in the frenetic, productive activities. And if, by reasons of economic disadvantage, I can't participate in that work because I'm unemployed or unemployable, or I can't participate in that consumption because I don't have credit or I don't have money, then I have a very negative view of myself. My self-esteem plummets. And that's why in our society we have a terrible issue of self-esteem among folk who are on the economic margins. A low self-esteem which turns into self-destructive behavior. Again, that's part of identity coming from what we do or what we consume. Sabbath is about a culture that tries to constrain all of that, as if there's some ancient wisdom in the Hebrew Bible that knew of this human tendency to be compulsive about our work, compulsive about how we exploit the earth, compulsive about how we consume. Well, that would stand to reason because the biblical story comes not from a European conquest of a new world. The biblical story comes from the fundamental fact of a story of being on the bottom of an economic pyramid, literally. The Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. And so this is a perspective on economics that comes from people who know the business end of a dysfunctional, oppressive economic story. Now, as you know, the biblical narrative of salvation is synonymous with the journey of liberation from a situation of slavery, a journey known as the Exodus. Now, it's no accident that the very first lesson of the biblical narrative to a people freed from slavery is an economic lesson. And we find that in the famous story of the manna in Exodus 16. Now, this is a story well known in our churches, mostly by virtue of the fact that we learned it in Sunday school. It's a story that we don't usually think of immediately as an economic story. We think of it as a miracle story. We think of it as a story of God providing so that we will trust. And if we trust, God will provide. The problem is that this story is not a story of trust at all. As it's introduced in verse 4, God says to Moses, listen, I will take care of providing the gift of sustenance. I will rain it down from heaven. Your job is to follow instructions. Notice how it doesn't say, trust me. It says, this is a test to see if Israel will follow instructions. You know how in church we talk a lot about trust, and then we salt stuff away in our 401k program. We like to spiritualize these things. Well, it turns out there are some very concrete instructions given here. Let's look at what they are. We're told in Exodus 16:16 to gather the manna, every person as much as they can eat. This is a liturgy of abundance, as Walter Brueggemann calls it. According to the numbers of the people you have in your tent. And the people of Israel, we're told, did so. They gathered, some more and some less. And here's the key. But when they measured it with an omer, those that gathered much had nothing over, and those that gathered little had no lack. Each tent gathered according to what they could eat. Here, friends, is the first lesson to free Israel outside of Egypt. Here is a God that's trying to retrain a people to live in a different way that will not end up again in slavery. And lesson number one is to make sure that if you gather more, you don't gather too much. And if you gather less, you gather enough. In other words, the social vision in Exodus 16 is a vision of a society in which there is such a thing as too much. And there is such a thing as too little. Now that is one of the points in which the biblical story directly contradicts this economic story we're in America. Because in our country, you can't be too rich. Have you ever met anyone who says, gee, I've got way more than enough? No, most people, if you took a poll door to door, would say, well, you know, I could use a little bit here and a little bit there, no matter where they are in the income scale. You can't be too rich in America. We entertain ourselves watching the lifestyles of the rich and famous, the glitz and the glamour and the spectacle of the celebrities and the super wealthy. But the flip side of that is, just as you can't be too rich in this country, you can't be too poor. That is to say, we have an infinite tolerance for affluenza, but we also have an infinite tolerance for poverty, which is why we all seem to live peaceably with the levels of homelessness that we have on our streets. In the biblical story, this is understood to be the beginning of a disaster if some people have too much and some people have too little. There's another version of the manna story that we find in the book of Numbers. We don't often read this story. It doesn't get into the Sunday school curriculum, but it's really sort of interesting. So the people worked all day and night and all the next day gathering quail. But while the meat was still between their teeth before it was consumed, the anger of God was kindled against the people. And God struck them with a great plague called Kibroth Hatava, which means the graves of greed. What a prescient story. It's underlining the problem of affluenza. It's underlining the problem of taking too much. If we take too much of the gift, we will end up with the graves of craving. That's old wisdom, an old wisdom which we could do well to heed in our time. This brings us to the three instructions of Exodus 16. Namely, the gift should be distributed equitably. Don't take too much and make sure you take enough. That's principle number one. The story goes on to say that make sure that the gift circulates rather than concentrating. Don't leave any of it over till morning. Don't store it up. Or what will happen to it? It will rot. It turns to worms. It composts. Now this is the wisdom of an old agricultural society which understands that all true wealth is organic wealth, and organic wealth has a shelf life. Therefore, make sure that that organic wealth is circulating so that it can be used by people who need it. In our time, we are all about accumulating, are we not? We think that the beginning of all wisdom is to store up our wealth. Accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. That is the law and the prophets. Do you know who said that? Karl Marx in the 19th century. He could see that there was something about our early capitalist culture that fetishized huge storehouses of wealth, saving up for a rainy day, allegedly, but in fact, building our wealth and social power and stratifying society into those who had large storehouses and those who had nothing. The second principle of Exodus 16 is make sure the wealth is constantly circulating. And keep the Sabbath. This is the third one. Limit human activity as a constant reminder of the economy of grace. And this is the first time that we meet the Sabbath idea in Scripture. It's actually not the fourth commandment, it's the first commandment. This is 4 chapters before Moses goes up to Sinai to get the commandments. The Hebrews called the manna manhu. It's sort of a strange phrase in Hebrew, and it means, what the heck is this? And that's exactly the reaction that we have when we're hearing this story. What the heck is this? Why haven't we ever heard this before? Why does this seem so strange to our ears? I love that about the biblical narrative, is it encodes our resistances to it, our befuddlement by it. And yet, it wants to make certain that we understand that this story is a new story for the people of God.
My name is Gloria Kinsler. We've been living here in Altadena since our retirement in 2001. I think we began to think about money very early because right after we were married, shortly after I guess, we went to Guatemala to work. My husband Ross was a theological educator, worked at a seminary, and I was pretty much a housewife with 3 young children. You know, we had a very decent salary. And when we went down there, it was like we were wealthy beyond any means. And it was such a shock. And we began to realize we could not live as middle-class Americans in Guatemala. There was something obscene about that. And so we had decided from the beginning to receive a salary that was the same as our Guatemalan colleagues who were teaching in the seminary. So that's kind of how it started, because the difference between not only how much money we had, but the privileges we had had growing up as middle-class people in Central America was not only shocking, but unjust. But because we were working on a book on the New Testament teaching about the Jubilee. And of course, as all of you know, it begins with the start of the Manna story. And that story really captivated us in that there was always enough for everyone. Nobody had too much and nobody had too little. And that was such an important event in Israel's life that they put that bit of manna on top of the tabernacle to carry it around to remind themselves that they were not going to live like they lived in Egypt. But I think it's very important that we realize that we have been so spoiled, and we think we are entitled to all the things that we have. And 80% of people don't even live on $2 a day of our world. And so that the fact that we might consider this is obviously a very spiritual and issue, a moral issue, something that we as persons who consider ourselves moral and want to be ethical, and especially those of us who think of ourselves as trying to be followers of Jesus, really have to work with and struggle with. And it's not hard. I don't know what else.